let's just touch on this point of rational discourse, because in any disagreement, any conflict, the way you reach compromises is through talking to the other side. It's through talking to the people who disagree with you
Absolutely.
and trying to find points of agreement. And where there is no agreement,
Absolutely.
negotiating. And when that process fails, what you're left with is war. And it seems to me that it's the fact these sort of debates have become so toxic and so weaponized. And if we think about this within the legal profession, I think Alison Bailey's case, again, it just shows that if this conflict is not addressed calmly, then the war of litigation is what follows. I just wondered, just on this issue of rational discourse, I'm a business owner, I'm a lawyer, I'm a father, I'm a friend, and I just wish everyone the best. And I want to facilitate, insofar as I am able, for everyone to achieve their full potential. And because we aren't a huge employer, I mean, we've got 100 staff, so we're not insubstantial either. But because we have a relatively small team, we're able to do that on quite a sophisticated basis. So if someone is from a particular background and requires certain support, we don't really do that through implementation of policy. We do it through discussion. We do it through individual meetings. We do it through consensus. We do it through monitoring next steps. To be fair to the larger corporate law firms, again, as an eternal optimist, I think the vast majority of people leading those firms around partnership tables or senior partners, I think they will want their best for their staff and their friends and their neighbours as well. But the difference there is they're trying to apply that fairness at scale. You know, thousands of staff, hundreds of partners, multiple locations. Is there an issue there, do you think, that the bigger law firms are at a disadvantage when trying to just apply that general fairness that I think drives most of us?
I think you're right. And this is a huge conversation. It's a fascinating conversation. But one of the kind of issues here is we talk about fairness, but not everybody agrees what that means. We will all have different definitions of what equality means, of what fairness means. Those definitions will depend in part on our politics, what our underlying sense of politics is. Now, this is interesting because one of the things that's happened in equality debates, and particularly in D&I, is it's become depoliticised. One of the reasons why D&I has been seen as quite palatable to so-called elites, organisational leaders, whatever, is precisely because it has been depoliticised, in theory at least. So it gives the impression that you can talk about these issues as though they are not political. Now, in practice, that's impossible because we are talking about equality, and equality is in its very essence about politics. It's about power. Who has it? Who's prepared to share it? Therefore, it is fundamentally political. If we pretend that it's not, the people who tend to benefit are the people who already have most power, because by obscuring that, you obscure the underlying systems and structures that give them that power. So the first thing I think we need to do is acknowledge that and sort of bring politics with a small p, not a capital P, back into the debate and acknowledge that this is a political issue where there will be conflicting interests. Because one of the other things that D&I has done is tend to suggest that we all share the same interests, which is probably maximising productivity and performance. And therefore, once we understand that, there are no conflicts in the employment relationship or anywhere else. Now, that's probably fundamentally untrue because there will always be conflicts in that relationship. So I think there's a lot of sort of more than one elephant in the room, so a way of putting it, that we need to kind of bring back into the conversation. But I would also say that we are all, at this point in history, operating in an extremely complex environment. Organisations particularly are subject to many competing demands from very many different stakeholders. And there's an argument, a very kind of famous academic has talked about organisational hypocrisy and has argued that in those circumstances, and again, I'm simplifying this and probably getting it a bit wrong, but in those circumstances, organisations and leaders will be hypocritical because they have to be, because in our modern world, the only way that you can function sometimes is to be a little bit hypocritical, to stand up, to talk about higher values than you can actually enact a lot of the time. I think we need to be more open and transparent about that, and to get those hypocrisies out on the table, to discuss them, to discuss the tensions, to open up about the conflicts, because I actually think that's a more productive way of moving forward than pretending that they don't exist. So I think that was a really roundabout way of answering your question, but hopefully it covered it in some sense.
No, it wasn't roundabout at all. I thought it was excellent. Yeah, I mean, let's just, before we move out, because I must let you go shortly, and I just want to wrap up on where do we go from here in terms of potential change. But I do just want to underline this point. I love talking. I love listening. I love being persuaded that I'm wrong. I love persuading other people that they are wrong. I love finding consensus. And most people I meet do. It's what we do in daily life, in business. And I think we all, as a legal profession, as a business community, and as societies, need to re-embrace this issue of conversation, discussion, and compromise, and not give up on finding the right compromises through continuing to discuss. And I mean, I have certain views on this, or on some of the issues we've touched upon, but I'm very capable of being persuaded that I'm wrong. And I think to some extent, the growth of the podcast and the longer form podcasts such as this has been a real positive in that we can take these time to unpack these issues, do a little bit of a deeper dive. And if that's the function of this new form of media in podcasting, then it makes me very happy indeed. But I must move on, because I know we need to let you go. Let's just move on to where we go from here. And I was very interested in that point you made earlier, Louise, about the solution to some of these issues, to this data which you've identified in your book, could be that we change the dial between seeking equality of opportunity and seeing equality of outcome. I guess, for just to close, what are the differences between those two, and in what way could equality of outcome be achieved?
Oh gosh, that's that's
another podcast, isn't it?
So yes, I think it is. I think it is. So equality of opportunity is associated with with meritocracy in particular. It's the idea that that opportunity should be available to the people who work hardest and have the most talent, and therefore they should be able to kind of get to the top. And they're being very, very, again, simplifying here. Equal opportunity is very closely associated with things like social mobility, actually, which is a really important policy agenda at the moment. One of the critiques, again, that people like me might have on it is going back to what we said earlier, that actually that vision of meritocracy can never be realised. It's just impossible, because there is no objective way we can measure these kind of outcomes. Even if we could, should we necessarily reward people who happen to be born with more talent in a particular that suits a particular kind of historical context? Is that necessarily fair in and of itself? But also, the idea of equal opportunity is seen as a way to produce a particular version of fairness or equality. But people like me would argue that actually it's a way to justify inequalities. So if you can convince sufficient people that their opportunities are solely based on their talent and hard work, it doesn't matter how unequal society becomes in terms of things like income and wealth, because you can argue that those inequalities are justified, they're fair, going back to the conversation we had earlier about merit. And therefore it's a way to sort of legitimate unfair systems, if you like, if you convince that that system is in place. It's based politically on the right, essentially. Equality of outcome suggests that actually, for a variety of reasons, that model doesn't work, and therefore we should share rewards more equally across society. So it's a kind of model of redistribution. It doesn't mean that there won't be differences in society, but it's a way of sharing rewards, both material and symbolic, more equally across society and within organisations as a whole. I don't mind admitting that politically I lean left, and my preference is towards equality of opportunity. And I think that there's lots of kind of selfish and non-self reasons to believe that is a better system, one of which, and I'll just give one example, is that equality of opportunity is very associated with a sort of very turbo-driven sort of capitalism, a very individualistic society, highly competitive. We're all scrabbling to get to the very top to get those relatively scarce rewards for ourselves. I actually don't think that makes for a particularly happy or contented or harmonious society. I think it undermines social cohesion in the end. And I think it's damaging, in a sense, to all of us. So for me, that's a good reason. I think we are all, in terms of well-being, better off if we have a little bit more equality of outcome. So that happens to be my preference. I think that we can take that down to the organisational level as well. So in terms of understanding what works, what really works in terms of diversity inclusion, what really makes organisations more inclusive, the best studies on this have found that you do things like you democratise your organisation, you reduce hierarchy, you share power, you make those big changes within organisations. It's not a panacea, nothing is, but it can lead to more diversity and inclusion, particularly the latter. Not many organisations can or want to do that at the moment, I would say. Often when you talk about the kind of more radical solutions, by radical I don't mean extreme, I mean those that go to the root causes of inequalities, they can sound extraordinary because we have been seeped in what I would call neoliberal discourses within this country for so long that a genuine alternative often seems almost ridiculous because we've been so trained to think of in a particular way of how things should be. So my kind of tiny mission, again, not to make myself sound too self-important, is to try and encourage a different conversation, to think about ideas that seem completely ridiculous at this point and try to normalize them a bit, try to make them part of our conversation, to make them seem more realistic, because I think those are the things that will drive genuine change.
Well, it's an interesting point to end, and you've articulated that so well. I mean, let me just give you my position on that before we do wrap up. I'm not particularly a political person. I guess you'd say, libertarian. I want people to be able to do largely what they want as long as they don't hurt anybody else. But to me, there is a balance here. I personally think that equality of opportunity is something we should always strive for. I think under the current system, and I'll move to your suggestion that we need to have a rethink on the current system, but under the current system, I wonder whether equality of opportunity will ever be achievable. Because just to use my own example, I was born with lots of privileges that I talked through earlier on. But was I in the same position? Did I have the same equality of opportunity as someone who was white, male, but happened to be from a very wealthy background and had public school and went to that sort of thing? Well, it could be argued that I didn't. It could be argued perhaps that my resilience and my background was something that was nurtured due to the fact I wasn't from that. But one thing I think which is a simple fact is that the inequality between the haves and the have-nots, not just in the UK, but I think across the world, in terms of more billionaires than ever, and poverty seemingly seeping wider and wider into society, a working poor is a phrase that's often used. It does seem to me that the possibility of radical change is something which might be both an opportunity, but I would also say a risk, because clearly, I think most people would say if we can level up those respective positions of the haves and the have-nots, that would be of wider societal benefit. And if that was through some sort of radical political or systematic change, well, that could be an opportunity. But I am a bit worried that the next phase in politics, particularly in the UK, might be a little bit more of the same. If we change governments, maybe there will be some movement left or some movement to different principles. But even if there is, I don't think the pace of change will be sufficient enough for some people. And the downside to that is sometimes a radical solution can emerge, which is much, much worse than the one we've got. And I'm worried about that. So to wrap up, maybe just to get your views on that slightly doomsday scenario.
Yeah, gosh. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I worry about that too, because it's almost like at the moment, I would say that I don't think we are being offered a true alternative. I think when that happens, it's a vacuum into which quite dangerous forms of power can take up that vacuum and lead to outcomes that we wouldn't necessarily want. So that really worries me. But what I would also say is it goes back a little bit to what I was saying in the way that the conversation around this about what's possible to say and how it's possible to think has become incredibly narrow over the last 20, 30 years. That's partly because of the media that we have in this country, around the way in which that conversation is controlled. And it's really problematic because I think I would say it makes politicians who are notionally on the left incredibly timid about stating a true alternative in case it loses them votes. And there's recent history that leads into that situation. But I would absolutely agree that I think it is a really dangerous, potentially, situation. But I also think that this sounds, how do I put this? It doesn't sound kind of patronising. I don't mean it in that sense. I think we need to understand inequality a little bit better, because I think there's a prevailing view that some people are poor and some people are rich. But I would argue that some people are poor because some people are rich. So some people get rich because other people are poor. And we need to understand the relativity of that we're all in these kind of social relations together. We're not isolated islands who are kind of not affecting other people and vice versa. And I think a kind of better understanding of our shared interests in that way would help us to have a different conversation around this. But I have to admit, I don't feel enormously optimistic about that at this very moment.